but I want to drive home graphically that there are two different kinds of QIRs that we generally use in the field, descriptive and analytical. And descriptive is really trying to understand and document inequality and inequity, while analytical is really us trying to explain it. So in the most simplistic terms, these are the differences between the two types of QIR we usually engage in. What's really important is to know is that it all starts with the question, but it's very, very important to understand that it's about the particular question we ask. So it's not any question. An intersectional question is not just about subgroup differences. The question we ask has to be about power, relationality, systems of oppression, and we have to center power at our center power when we ask the question. But before we start anything in any intersectionality endeavor, we have to have a solid question. And this motivates what we're doing in terms of descriptive QIR or analytical QIR. So, this is a really nice overview I like to share to give kind of a review of the different types. It helps us kind of focus on, okay, we understand that there are these two types. We understand that there's descriptive and analytical. However, this framing allows us to reference the purpose, focus, um, it gives a rubric for some methods that can be used, the different data usages, interpretation questions, and even, one or two common mistakes. So I just want to highlight that in last week's lecture, we talked a lot about secondary data analysis versus primary. And that is not represented in this chart. But again, when we kind of link these three um, webinars together, we know that secondary data usually lends itself more so to descriptive intersectionality versus analytical intersectionality. And so on your slide, I would make a little note about that in the data use box. I really like also that this slide kind of contextualizes just basics, right? So as we talked about before, at the simplest level, descriptive is kind of what is happening, what is going on, and kind of identifying axes of inequality and inequity. And analytical is describing what happens. So mechanisms, moderation, we even put structural effects under analytical. Um, and so this is a really good reference guide to refer back to while you take this journey and think more critically about kind of which method, descriptive or analytic QIR you're going to use. Okay, so now we're going to describe two different types of descriptive QIR. So I just refer to them as inductive and deductive. But the first one is really when we're working with predefined categories. So we're describing how some kind of outcome varies on this predefined category or these predefined social positions. And then number two, this is more so when we let the data tell us what's going on. So we identify patterns of lived experiences without these predefined social categories. And both of these are very important, relevant, descriptive intersectionality um, methods and approaches. And I would say, both of them in together or separately are a really important starting point when you're entering the world of QIR. So the first thing we want to do is describe how outcomes vary across these predefined categories. So you have a paper you want to do. You understand that you are very interested in um, Black sexual minority men, right? So you have an access of gender and sexuality and race, right? This is the predefined social positions. These are the predefined social positions you're interested in. And here I'm using these identities to reflect intersecting systems of racism, sexism, and homophobia. And you already know this and you're interested in depression. So here you already have your predefined categories and you have your health outcome. So your question is really, okay, so now I want to describe differences within these different social positions on depression outcomes, and how do I do this? And so there's lots of ways to do this, and we've already talked about Giano's paper where he does cross classification. And so cross classification is a beautiful method to use when you have these predefined categories because it allows you to look and compare across different categories, right? So when we looked at the ACEs in Giano's paper before, you know, the cross classification method kind of identified these top 14 of the 30 groups that were really important to understanding the ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, right? And that is an identification, right, which aligns with descriptive intersectionality. And then Giano did a beautiful job of tying this back to trying to understand, systems of power, as we saw in the last session. So this is just again a throwback to showing how, looking at these predefined categories, we started with three, but then of course they can be broken up in a lot of different ways. And this is a throwback to showing how classification is a descriptive QIR method that identifies this. And then in session one, we also went through the walkthrough um, using this method. Okay, so something a bit more new in our conversation is really understanding how to identify patterns of lived experiences without predefined social categories. And I actually find this a little bit more complicated just because usually when um, I have a question that is very specific to, intersecting social positions. However, I can see many researchers just not knowing or there being a new area of an outcome in which we just simply don't know. So, if someone was interested, for example, in a health outcome of, Asperger's spectrum disorder, we probably know very little about, what categories and social positions we need to really be paying attention to, and if there's some systems of power there that we haven't really paid attention to. And so this is a beautiful, ripe question to use these more data up approaches to descriptive intersectionality. So, we it's also beautiful because we don't need to decide the relevant groups in advance. Um, we're able to identify, these patterns and experiences first. And then what we do is we usually export that data, and then we can examine which groups are most frequently represented in these different patterns. So is it women? Is it men? Is it, by education? Is it by, the region of the country you live in, or any of those intersections? So we ask particular questions such as, what patterns of experience exist and who is most frequently represented. Um, and this matters a lot because conventional categories may miss meaningful distinctions. And so I think if you're following along with your slides and you're able to make notes, that that's one of the most important things to highlight because even in the work that we do, in which I already have very predefined categories in which I'm interested in, or predefined social positions I'm interested in, what I'll often find and what um, I have a note about in our walkthrough for goal 3 is that there are a lot of categories that you might be missing. Not categories that are just benign, but categories that are associated with power and need to be reflected and incorporated into our understanding of some outcome. And so if you do initial analysis or through literature searches or conversations, you start really seeing that there might be something you're missing, then these are really great approaches to kind of understanding what these additional social categories that you might need to include are. Um, so, for example, in a lot of my work, I use sexism, racism, homophobia. Um, but scholars like Dr. Tanae Lewis have really forced me to look more at including axes of socioeconomic status, right? And so that's something that I think that I might look at in the future, but also in doing so, use some of these more methodological QIR methods that we will be able to assess categories using kind of this data up approach. Okay. So, Liu uses this data-driven approach to identify intersectional subgroups. This is a beautiful paper. And basically, in this paper, I don't think you can see it very well here, but Liu uses the C-tree approach. And the C-tree approach I talked briefly about in the last section, but it's a really good approach that you can use when you're trying to kind of understand what the most important social categories are for some kind of outcome. And so Lee has this really nice sentence where they talk about, unlike traditional regression approaches, which assume these additive and linear relationships among predictors, conditional inference trees allow for the detection of these nonlinear interactions. And they automatically account for the higher order interactions without requiring these manual specifications. In addition, C-tree was not made obviously for intersectionality specifically, but the ways in which we can use intersectionality in this descriptive approach is really thinking about how, for example, these higher order social positions, you know, are more important than others. So, for example, in a C tree, you might find that the first branch and most important branch is actually just race, right? And then the C tree will let you have other branches that show you the next kind of important categories. And so this might be, other interactions, disability status, and socioeconomic status, right? And so it allows you to kind of to see in this hierarchical distribution what are the important social conditions and factors that we might want to address. And I love this quote so much. And they say we use the term intersectional not to imply a statistical interaction between arbitrary predictors, but to reflect the convergence of marginalized identity and social forces that jointly shape risk. And I feel like, especially on the descriptive side, C trees are really apt and able to do that very quite nicely. So someone will raise their hand and say, but Stephanie, I have seen C trees used for analytic intersectionality too. Yes, they can be used for analytic intersectionality too. However, for purposes of this particular paper and thinking about descriptive, this is a really nice use of C tree for descriptive QIR. Okay, so the other method that we will use and talk about in depth in our walkthrough or our step-by-step is LCA, latent class analysis, LCA, LPA, or latent profile analysis. Latent profile analysis and latent class analysis are the same thing, but latent class analysis uses binary and latent profile analysis uses continuous. And basically, latent class analysis is a really useful tool in which you can identify different social conditions and patterns of social conditions, which is really nice. So, in this very beautiful paper by Hall, he was basically trying to understand how different um, mental health profiles load across different BIOPOC SMW. So BIOPOC. Oh my goodness. I should have spelled it out because obviously the specific acronym now is eluding me. Um, BIOPOC, sexual minority women. I use the word BIOPOC so often that like the very particular letters, I've forgotten what they mean. But it's basically like people of color, sexual minority women. Um, And so this is a really useful framework that Hall uses, and he talks about how this in using LCA and LPA, he used LCA, but I always say LPA because it's really important that if you use um, continuous variables, you call it latent profile analysis instead of latent class analysis shows how these different profiles don't land equally among different populations of biopop SMW. And that is very important because we assume erroneously often in these single access analyses that discrimination is discrimination on the same level for every single BIOPOC SMW, for example. And we know that's not true. And so this analysis in this framework helps us understand what those differences are and where they lie. And again, in our step by step, we'll be walking through both of those, the C tree and the LCA in detail. Okay, so let's work through an LCA example here, however. Okay, so in the Google Drive folder, you have all of these data, so you can recreate this. Our example in the step-by-step is different, but if you want to go back and recreate this to make sure you understand, you can. So we're going to do a latent class analysis method for descriptive intercategorical intersectionality. I'm sorry, descriptive intercategorical intersection intersectional analysis. Woo, that's a lot of words. So we're going to use the add health. Last week we used PSID. This week we're going to use add health. The official name is the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent and Adult Health. But we all just say add health because obviously that other name is way too long. And then the outcome we're going to use is discrimination profiles. So we're going to use the EDS. The EDS was slightly modified in add health, but it largely um, maintains the questions of the scale. We are particularly using Wave 6. Add Health is a longitudinal study. We have been following these now no longer young people. They're no longer young people, but no young people since I think 2000. And so the last wave of data collection that is publicly available is 2003, wave six, 2003. And so that's the data we'll use. And it's important to distinguish that this is longitudinal, but for the purpose of ease of interpretation, we're just going to use cross-sectional. Also, here for this specific example, we're going to use race, gender, and socioeconomic differences in class. And the specific goal is to identify where classes align with the different intersecting social positions. Okay. So the research question is, what distinct patterns of discrimination experiences exist in the population? And so the first thing you should notice is that usually there's two questions um, uh, uh, when we do LCA because there's a first step which is actually identifying these patterns through LCA. And then the next step is seeing how they align with social positions. So the second question is, do these patterns align with or cut across conventional social categories, such as race and gender? So another note you might want to make is that when we do LCA, especially in a intersectionality framework, we always have two research questions. And then it's we've talked about this already, but there's no predefined groups. We've already talked about ad health. Wave six I guess wave six is actually 2016 to 2018. I have to double check that because I actually do think that wave six is 2003. So I'm just going to put a note to double check that. We're using the EDS. Those are the socio-demographics we're using. This is a cross-sectional snapshot, but you can use LTA, which is latent class or latent transition analysis, which actually will allow you to use longitudinal data in this framework. Really powerful, really complex, really takes and sometimes takes a long time to run, but if you're interested in those changing trajectories or changing patterns over time, it's a really nice analysis. And then, if we were just looking at conventional approaches, we would, do some kind of summation discrimination scale, and then we do some kind of interaction term in a linear regression model. And then we would talk about group differences. That's not what we're doing when we're thinking more about this lane class and C-tree method. We're identifying patterns, and we're saying that these patterns and groups probably vary across these different patterns of discrimination, and we want to know how.